Can I say thank you for the invitation to come and talk to you today? I think this is the most amazing thing I wish had happened to me when I was doing my PhD a few years ago, was to find myself in a space where I have my peers to talk to about their research. I wish somebody sat me down and said to me, it's quite wild out there, you've got to be tough, and this is what you need to do. But you know, I think the Alzheimer Society are doing a great job in putting together events like this, specifically for ECRs, from biomedical sciences, from social sciences, bringing you together to share ideas and just to be inspired by each other's work. I think that's really amazing. And so yes, so that's my work and that's what I do. I'm based at the Geller Institute of Aging and Memory. We are kind of a very small group. We're a group of 10 or so academics that have come together in the past 2-3 years from different backgrounds. I'm a sociologist, I'm a medical sociologist, and my interests are mostly in sort of technological innovations or science and technology studies, but thinking more about inequalities. I did my PhD a few years ago, and I was interested in human involvement in clinical trials, specifically thinking about why healthy people take part in clinical trials, and then considering the regulatory and ethical implications on how we make sense of inequality and why certain people are more likely to be attracted by $3,000 for 7 days in a trial unit and others are not. And what does that tell us about our society? But at the Geller Institute, we're interested in thinking more about independence, or improving independence and experiences of care of older people with dementia. And over the past years, we've had funding from different sources that we have used to develop research. So we've got sociologists, we've got philosophers on the team, and some artists, and then, of course, some sociologists like myself who tend to ask very political and sometimes often difficult questions. And the current research that I'm doing, well, I was talking to somebody the other day yesterday that I'm really happy to be here today, because the past 3 weeks I've been spending time on a hospital ward doing this study, which is an NHR-funded study where we're looking at the use of restraints on older people with dementia. Now, that study is interested in finding out ways in which we can improve care for older people with dementia, but also thinking about the rationales when and how restraints are used on people, and the impact on both staff and patients when those interventions are actually administered. Now, it's not a gotcha study. So every time I've said to people, we're doing a restraint study, the response is, how are they responding to you on the ward? They're very lovely people, and it's been really, really fun being part of this work in that space. And so some of the examples that I'm going to talk to you about today sort of derived from this work. The third challenge I said I was going to say about this talk is that I've been asked to talk about representation, and how do you talk about representation without really being overly political about it and getting everybody to think or getting everybody to feel really uncomfortable. Now, I wanted to start by saying talking about representation and inequalities is absolutely uncomfortable for everyone. Even for me, it's very uncomfortable. But it's okay to be uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable, and we have to face it, and sometimes we have to sort of think about those things in those lines. So the political context of representation and public engagement, some of the work that Ben was talking about yesterday and Anna was talking about earlier today, is that the idea of inclusion in research is actually very high on the research agenda. Most research funders have deliberately made inclusion a key criteria of their work. And historically, that has come from the need for building public trust. So if you're very familiar with history, is that we've got Tuskegee in the background, we've got, the thalidomide incidents in the past, and public trust in scientific developments can be quite tenuous, and it has to be built, and it has to be ascertained and built. And all those all those events have contributed to lack of trust in scientific endeavors, and therefore we need to build that. And alongside this, therefore, demands for science to address social issues are identified as pressing. There was a lot of that talk earlier today in the session that we had with Anna, that we need to think about ways in which the issues we're addressing are actually pressing for people. But we can also think about the need for responding to these issues, or in response, science have been sort of encouraged to think about proposals or programs to embed public engagement as part of the research agenda, or the things that we do. Actually, in the research that we have done at GAIAM, we have found that if they have ever asked us to cut down our budget, whenever we've put down a proposal, right, they would say, you can cut down a human resource, but they never cut down the public engagement element of things. So if you want a secret on getting funding, public engagement has to be really high on the list. Now, you know what happens, Anna, don't you? If you get a lot of projects with only a research question and loads of public engagement, I'm to blame for that. And then there's also been attempts to normalize this form of dialogue, sort of dialogue between the lay public and scientists, to try and make it part of everyday, sort of a core requirement of research. And Wellcome Trust, NIHR, there's a lot of that talk that's actually going on in that space. So why should we talk about public engagement? I think the first one is the public is perceived. Public engagement, or engaging with the public, or including the public, is a way of sort of democratizing both science and healthcare delivery. Is that we are bringing in diverse voices and opening up spaces that are sometimes exclusive to include everybody. And this openness then is sort of an openness to dialogue between the public and lay people. So public participation is now considered key to the successful implementation of technologies. So there's always going to be the need for us to be successful. We have to have that particular element in it. But there's also another part that is about understanding public's hopes, our hope. I think Louise pointed to this about the current trends, you know, about the state of healthcare at the moment, and both health and social care in itself. And therefore, engaging the public is also about understanding public's hopes and desires for the future, and what technologies are part of that future. But I also want to add here, it's also about fears. Because I think if there's a fear we all, having spent so much time on the ward, on hospital wards the past 3 months, and my own life being brought into perspective when I see older people with dementia, is that we all have one fear. And one fear is one day being old, being unwell in a care home alone, unable to have anybody else to look after us, right? But I would like to add a dimension to that fear, is that we all have that. But can you imagine being a black person who grew up in 1950s London, getting old today, having dementia and having to go into a care home? What does that actually feel like for you? That the people who you went to school to racially abused you, were really horrible, and now as old as you are, you're both going into the same space. What does that actually look like? So when we're thinking about research, it's thinking about all the different dimensions, about the different ways in which researching in itself and the ways in which we provide care has implications for different kinds of people in different ways. So how have approaches to science, I'm rushing, how have approaches to science looked like, approaches to inclusion look like in the past? And I'm not suggesting in any way that anyone in here does this, but this is what Louise has in a way pointed to some of these things. So in the past, there's been a lot of focus on the idea that, and I think Ben said this yesterday as well, the idea that there's the performative nature of inclusion, that we can have it box ticking exercise, that we can just say, well, we have We have lay people on the board, and therefore we are quite fine. We have lay people included in our research, and therefore we are actually fine. But I'm so pleased that the Alzheimer Society do not just tick a box. You know, they get people involved in the development and assessment of research and going forward. But outside of this space, there's a lot of that goes on in which inclusion becomes a performative thing. It becomes something that we do to look good. It's a kudos. You know, we're quite a diverse group of people, but does that really bring about change? You know, it's a question to ask. But another thing is, it is also claimed elsewhere, Ben pointed to this yesterday, the idea that implementation of technological innovation depends on an informed public, and therefore the public in this context is perceived as ignorant, and therefore we have to educate them, and therefore what we see then is Tony Blair's education is the way forward in order to engage the public. And the so-called deficit model often entails a technocratic view of the public as ignorant and unqualified to inform science. But we need to begin to rethink that. We need to begin to question how that actually works, because in many ways, what that does is that research then sort of does a series of things. The idea of the public as being ignorant, there's nowhere where that has been shown the most than in research on ethnic minority experiences of dementia. Over the past 30 years, if you're going to go on Google Scholar and look at experience of dementia for ethnic minorities, these are the things you're going to find. Lack of knowledge, cultural beliefs, language barriers, lack of engagement or interest. Now, that could be true. But for the past 30 years, these have been produced and reproduced and restated again. They've become even part of everyday policy balance. They talk about these things, quite a lot. They've become established. But what that does, I worry, is that it then sort of aggregates, and there's, I suppose in addition to that, there's this aggregation of ethnic minority communities as one whole, homogeneous whole. So we can talk of ethnic minorities as a group. What that does, therefore, is that it reinforces stereotypes, it entrenches sort of inequalities, it excludes people from the research process instead of understanding differences between communities and the nuances between those differences. These things are just aggregated and reported as a whole. Therefore, I argue that we need to sort of, Louise pointed to this, my last point, that we need to, despite all these things that have happened over the past 30 years, there's been no difference, by the way. Even today, the research that was published in 2023 is going to talk about lack of knowledge, cultural beliefs, language barriers, and you're thinking, how long does it take to actually bring about change? And some of these things, sort of are kind of real for everybody else, but for ethnic minorities, these become much more complex and much more deeper. So we need to think much more carefully about this. I therefore suggest that we need to think about moving away from the orthodoxy. And by that, I'm thinking about the need to focus on individual communities rather than aggregating ethnic minorities as a whole, and take the potential for research on contributing to inequality seriously. There was reference, Francesco referenced here the idea that scientists sometimes can be focused, we can be so focused on the we can be very intrigued or sort of drawn to curious about what actually the things that we do look like, without thinking so much about the impact that our research or even the research questions actually have on communities we serve, or even the people we are intending to actually engage with. And therefore, we need to think more seriously about these things when we're designing our research. But we also need to work with communities to develop research that addresses their pressing concerns. But also consider inequality here. I'm giving examples about ethnic minorities because that's what my research interests are. But we need to consider inclusion in a wider sense, to begin to think about class, to think about gender, to think about sexuality and sexual identity, and how it all intersects with aging and dementia, and what impacts they have on the groups or communities that we serve. So what have we done at GAIM? Now, I'm going to sort of give you a very quick picture of what we have done, and it might, I worry that I might risk painting a rosy picture, but hopefully I will give you an idea of what we've actually done. So as a means of moving away from the orthodoxy, one of the things that we're really good at is developing research with communities and not for communities. So right from the outset, we have research advisory committees, members of the public that we involve or engage in the development of our research ideas. So in the Northeast, in the Northwest, in Manchester, we have a sort of an advisory group from the Asian community that we engage with our research. We have somebody in our research that goes and spends time with them to actually find out what the issues are they're facing. As a result of that, we can develop better research. In London, we have an African and African Caribbean group that we take our research questions to go and consult with them about our research and the things that we actually do. And we also have considered the idea of diversity in a broader sense. So we have sort of a group of people. We have a group in the Northwest on the Welsh England border, very small town. You know, in terms of economics, nothing goes on there. We have a team that we have a group of people that we work with in that particular community, and we engage with them in our research. In Wales, we have an LGBTQ group, older people from the community that we engage with in research in that particular sense. So we do consider that beyond inequality as a way of doing that. But we also work with our communities to find out what they want to do. So as a way of engaging with people, with communities, it's really hard. There are no hard-to-reach communities, I would like to say, but there are sometimes lazy researchers who just want to keep up with the status quo. But what we found was that to engage with communities, we have to find out what they do and what they want. With our partners, we started asking them, what are you actually doing? How can we include what you do in our research so that when we get funding, we can support your activities well as we collect our data in the process? And oftentimes they came up with art workshops. We would love to have an art workshop with our community. And what then happens is that we then incorporate art workshops in our research. But we don't just do the art workshops for the purposes of having conversations on restraints and your experiences in hospital. We think about their schedule or their program for the year. How can we incorporate these as a service that we provide to you that sort of adds to their existing service that they actually provide without costing them a lot of money? We have the funding for it incorporated in our research. So there's that sort of working together. Well, as we get access to them, we build trust with them, but we also provide a service. So we are not just walking in and walking out, we are there for the long haul with them. And doing that has been very helpful in getting them on our side. So when we say, we have a research idea, we would like participants in our research, they always say, you're welcome. You can come here anytime. But can you imagine if I just went in and did an art workshop, one-off, and then walked away? The next time I come back, the door will be shut. So there's this idea that we need to build trust and relationships with people that are not just sort of for the moment, but long-term. Whether it's a biomedical research that you're trying to do, or whether it's a social science research that you're trying to do, begin to think about ways in which you could engage with the public in that sense. And I think there's also other ways we can work with it. And the next slide, I'm not so sure if this would work, Ben. Can you play that video for me? I'll let you watch that, and then I'll talk around it.
Today's event is extremely important to older people, particularly for those communities that don't come from the majority community. And what I mean by that are communities from Africa, from the Caribbean, Southeast Asia. In general, local authorities provide a service that treats everybody the same, and it doesn't take any account of cultural difference. We believe that cultural sensitivity is absolutely important in terms of the care of older people.
The value of openness in action, I think, is extended beyond our clients at New Life. I think this afternoon what we've done is bring together older people from across Hampstead and Fulham, brought them together where they could have a social afternoon and create new memories together.
Do not sit down. We know that music plays an important role in our well-being. We all put on a song, depends on what our mood is. And so today, just being around music, just being out socialising, for a group of older people that tends to be isolated within the community, today is of great importance.
Music which we can relate back to when we were younger is really important, and we can start to think about the events that were happening around that time, where we were, what we were doing with our families, etc. So the cultural understanding of the types of music that we would have been listening to when we were younger is really important. I really welcome the collaboration between Union Life and the University of West London. It's really important that we can start to really test some of our thinking, some of our hypotheses, and really carry a bit more research in some of the areas that we feel are absolutely necessary to handle social care in the 21st century.
It's really important that people don't underestimate the value of day centres or day services or even community services, because we hold people together so they don't fall through the net, and we offer culturally responsive care, which is really important and is often quite missing.
Right. What would you like to do? What is it that you've always wanted to do that you don't have the resources to do? But what we wanted to do was, we only knew one organization in the area, and we wanted to meet other people. And they said, we've always wanted to have an afternoon tea and disco for older people in the area and play music. We said, but what's holding you back? And they said, but we don't have the money. So we said, well, give us a budget. Let's see how that actually works. They gave us a budget, and that kicked in motion a series of events. We went to them with that offer, and then Fulham Palace Gardens, posh place, they said, we can host you. For free, you don't have to pay. And that's an expensive place to go. And then the next thing is the local authorities say, well, we can pay for transport for people to move forward. So that initial action kicked into motion a series of genuine acts of kindness to try and bring this event together. And what that did for us was we had about 75, 80 older people, nearly 60 of them had dementia, come together for an afternoon. And we met organizations from around the area. So apart from knowing one organization now, as a researcher, in terms of my engagement with research, I have 10 other organizations I can go to and engage with my research and bring them on board. And that way, you build trust and you build relationship. So building on the success of that event, what you have is this week on Thursday, Fulham Palace Gardens again have said, wow, it's a Windrush celebration, are you going to do anything? And Nubian Life come back to us and go, are you going to help us again? And we went, oh, all right then, let's do this, shall we? So again on Thursday this week, we're going to be doing that from 1 to 5. We're going to bring older people, just a safe space to play music and just have a party. I wanted to say that inequalities are actually real. And the questions that we ask, or whenever we talk about representation in research, are questions of health and illness, life and death. Sad as it might look, this is what it is like. Whether it's class, whether it's gender, whether it's race or ethnicity, they are actually very real issues that we are dealing with. And therefore, as researchers, if our research is poorly conceived, it has the potential to make things worse rather than resolve those issues. And therefore, as researchers, we need to be aware of those particular issues. But we also all have a duty, I think, to consider an inclusive approach to research, to be aware of the questions that we're asking and the things that we actually do. It's not a box-ticking exercise. It's actually just required. I know that in the days when inclusion and have been infused with the now politicized concept of woke, it's become really difficult to talk about these issues. But those issues that people who are pushing questions of social justice are asking for is that we consider the impact that inequalities have on certain marginalized communities. And we need to build relationships with communities, to have an inclusive approach or to get people involved in our research requires talking to communities. But that requires taking time, by the way, and it's expensive, it takes money. But once you've done it, it's worth it. It makes things really, really useful and easy. I have to end there because I've seen a stop sign. Thank you.